Before we begin, here's a quick invitation. If you enjoy documentary-style investigations into the forgotten corners of biblical history, feel free to subscribe. It genuinely helps us reach more people who love exploring topics most documentaries never touch. Today, we open one of the oldest and most debated questions in ancient theology, a question that shaped worldviews from Mesopotamia to the early church. In the vast landscape of biblical scholarship, few mysteries are as persistent or as misunderstood as the true origin of demonic spirits. The Bible speaks of them frequently, yet never pauses to explain where they come from. They appear suddenly, already active, already dangerous, already influencing the world of ancient Israel. To understand them, researchers must trace a trail that leads far deeper than the surface of the text. Through ancient languages, Near Eastern belief systems, post-exilic theological development, and the literature of the Second Temple period. Only then do we begin to see the shape of a theory that dominated early Judaism and early Christianity. A theory that traces these beings to a moment of rebellion long before the flood. To begin, it helps to understand the world in which biblical authors lived. The deserts of the ancient Near East were not empty. They were believed to be haunted by forces invisible to the living. Archaeological finds from Mesopotamia show that people feared the restless dead, spirits believed to wander abandoned places seeking warmth, water, or a host. These ideas were not fringe. They shaped rituals, burial practices, and household protections for centuries. When the biblical authors wrote about wilderness spirits or creatures that lurked in ruins, their audience already carried a long cultural memory of such beliefs. But Israel's scriptures went in a different direction. Instead of attributing malevolent forces to generic ghosts, the Hebrew Bible embedded these beings in a larger story, a cosmic conflict involving heavenly beings, human corruption, and a catastrophic era known later through Jewish writings as the Days of the Watchers. Though this story is only hinted at in the canonical text, later Jewish literature preserved the details that ancient readers would have known. To understand demons in the time of Jesus or the apostles, one must understand this older narrative. The book of Genesis contains one of the most cryptic passages in all Scripture, the appearance of the sons of God, who took human women as wives and produced the Nephilim. The text is brief, almost deliberately understated, yet it describes a boundary being crossed, divine beings invading human life in a way that leads to chaos and violence. Later Jewish interpretation saw this as the beginning of a cascade of corruption that plunged ancient humanity into unprecedented lawlessness. These beings, called Watchers in 1st Enoch, were said to have taught forbidden knowledge, weapon-making, sorcery, occult practices, and rituals that distorted human culture. According to the Enochic tradition, the offspring of these unions were giants, beings neither fully angelic nor fully human, born into a world not built to contain them. Their physical strength and violent nature destabilized societies, and their appetites pushed the ancient world toward collapse. When the flood came, these hybrid beings perished, but their spirits did not return to heaven, for they were not heavenly, nor did they descend to Sheol, for they were not ordinary humans. Instead, their disembodied souls were condemned to wander the earth, rootless, hostile, and eternally dissatisfied. This concept is the foundation of the theory embraced by early Judaism and early Christianity, that demonic spirits originate from the dead giants, the offspring of the Watchers. They are trapped in the realm of the living, unable to rest, unable to die again, unable to inhabit a natural home. Early Jewish writings even describe them as spiritually dehydrated, desperately seeking places of refuge, influence, or embodiment. When Jesus speaks of an unclean spirit, walking through arid places seeking rest, this reflects a well-known Second Temple idea. The spirits of these ancient beings roam desolate regions, driven by hunger for presence and control. The archaeological record supports this worldview. Across the Levant, excavations have uncovered protective amulets, household figurines, and inscriptions invoking divine protection against harmful spirits. These items show that ancient people did not fear vague forces. They feared distinct, hostile entities believed to interact with human life. Even in Israel, where monotheism shaped doctrine, everyday artifacts reveal a constant wariness of invasion by unseen forces. The people's fears mirrored the descriptions preserved in Enoch, Jubilees, and later Jewish commentary, entities that operated independently, resisted righteousness, and thrived in places of abandonment. Yet the Hebrew Bible itself speaks of darker beings without defining them. Terms like Serim, often translated as goat demons, appear in texts warning Israel not to offer sacrifices to wandering spirits. Other passages mention Shadim, malevolent beings that brought harm or misfortune. These references suggest an underlying belief in spiritual adversaries active in the world, even if the canonical text does not describe their origin directly. The silence of Scripture on this point created an opening that post-exilic Jewish thinkers filled with the Watcher tradition. By the time we reach the New Testament era, the idea of unclean spirits as wandering, disembodied beings is already deeply rooted. When Jesus confronts such entities, the language reflects Second Temple interpretation, not a new theology invented in the first century. These spirits recognize authority, speak with intelligence, and behave as independent personalities, not as fallen angels, but as something earthbound, something connected to a primordial age before the flood. The early church fathers took this understanding seriously. Justin Martyr, Athenagoras, Irenaeus, and others wrote that demons come from the spirits of the Nephilim, offspring of the Watchers. They held that these beings remain on earth because their nature is tied to the earthly realm. Their rebellion began in flesh, and their influence continues through invisible oppression. This explanation, rooted in Jewish tradition and affirmed by early Christian authorities, formed the dominant view for centuries before medieval interpretations shifted the focus toward fallen angels. All of this sets the stage for a deeper investigation, one that examines the fragments of Scripture, the landscapes of the ancient world, the writings of the Second Temple era, and the voices of early theologians. To understand the true origin of demonic spirits, we must journey through a world where the line between the divine and the human was crossed, and the consequences echo through every era of biblical history. The ancient Near Eastern world was a tapestry of beliefs, rituals, and fears woven over thousands of years, a landscape where spiritual danger was considered as real as drought or invading armies. To understand how demonic spirits were interpreted in biblical times, we must examine this broader cultural environment because Israel did not exist in a vacuum. Its people lived beside empires whose traditions shaped regional thought. And though Israel's scriptures offered a radically different worldview, the vocabulary and imagery used by biblical authors still interacted with the world around them. Across Mesopotamia, one belief was nearly universal. The dead who were not properly buried or honored could become restless spirits. Archaeologists have unearthed clay tablets, burial inscriptions, and protective charms referencing beings known as etemu, troubled ghosts that lingered near ruined cities, dark rooms, or abandoned fields. These spirits were seen as hungry, thirsty, and cold, eternally seeking relief that the living could provide. The idea was simple. An unfulfilled existence created spiritual agitation. To people of that era, the desert was not merely a geographic feature, it was a spiritual boundary. It represented a place where order dissolved, where the dead or the supernatural could intrude upon the world of the living. This helps explain why biblical texts describe desolate places as locations where unclean spirits wandered. Even though Israel rejected the polytheistic framework of its neighbors, everyday people shared an intuitive perception of the wilderness as a liminal space, where danger was both physical and invisible. Unlike the speculative myths surrounding Mesopotamian ghosts, the Hebrew Bible introduces categories of malevolent beings without providing detailed explanations. This silence reflects a larger pattern in Scripture. Certain concepts are assumed to be already familiar to the audience. When biblical authors use terms such as Shedim or Serim, they did not pause to define them. Instead, they wrote as though their readers already possessed a cultural sense of what these forces were and why they posed a threat. This tacit familiarity suggests that Israel had inherited a conceptual vocabulary that needed no elaboration. For example, the word shadim appears in contexts condemning idol worship. While the term is rare, its usage conveys more than abstract evil. It implies tangible, malevolent entities associated with pagan rituals. Another term, Sirim, evokes beings connected to abandoned places, often depicted as goat-like apparitions haunting the wilderness. Ancient Near Eastern iconography includes similar figures, reinforcing the idea that such imagery resonated across cultures. Biblical writers stripped these figures of any divine legitimacy, but did not deny their existence as spiritual threats. As Israel's identity solidified, especially after the Babylonian exile, its understanding of spiritual forces evolved. The trauma of exile had reshaped the nation's theology. Exposure to Persian thought introduced new frameworks, including a heightened sense of cosmic conflict between forces aligned with light and darkness. While Israel did not adopt Persian dualism wholesale, elements of this worldview influenced Jewish literature from the post-exilic period. Angels and demons were now conceptualized less as abstract metaphors and more as organized spiritual beings participating in a cosmic drama. During this era, writings such as the Book of Daniel reveal a fully developed angelology. Heavenly beings engage in real conflict, influencing nations and empires. If angels played strategic roles in the world's operations, it implied the existence of opposing spirits with their own agendas. Yet even with this development, the Hebrew Bible avoids explicitly detailing the origins of harmful spirits. Instead, it offers glimpses, suggestive but incomplete fragments, that later Jewish writers expanded into cohesive narratives. This expansion flourished during the Second Temple period, especially in works like 1 Enoch and Jubilees. These texts provided a framework that explained the presence of malevolent spirits while remaining anchored in the brief Genesis account of the Watchers. According to this tradition, the crisis of the pre-flood world was not only moral or social, it was cosmological. Divine beings violated their station, their offspring destabilized creation, and their deaths introduced spiritual consequences that had no natural resolution. The disembodied spirits of the giants became the demonic entities that plagued humanity thereafter. The influence of this worldview extended far beyond theoretical theology. Excavations across Israel and surrounding regions have uncovered amulets engraved with prayers for protection against invisible forces. Their inscriptions mention harm-causing entities that could afflict households, livestock, or travelers. These artifacts serve as physical testimony that ancient people believed spiritual forces operated in close proximity to everyday life. Even in communities deeply committed to monotheism, the fear of hostile spirits persisted, shaped by both scripture and surrounding culture. These protective objects also reveal something else. The threats were perceived as personal. They were not faceless manifestations of fate or fortune. They were active intelligences. Some amulets invoke divine names to restrain spirits, suggesting that the enemy was not merely a symbol, but an actual presence seeking to influence or harm. This aligns neatly with the Enochic model, where disembodied spirits wander in search of embodiment or influence, restless, dissatisfied, and driven by their unnatural origins. The linguistic landscape of the ancient world contributes further insight. Many terms used to describe harmful beings have connotations tied to destruction, desolation, or wilderness. They evoke imagery of torn landscapes, ruins swallowed by sand, deserted sanctuaries, or collapsed cities, places where life has retreated and disorder reigns. Such locations became associated with spiritual danger. In this sense, geography became theology. Barren terrain symbolized the sphere of beings who existed outside the order God intended. The Hebrew Bible also connects these beings with idolatry, implying a direct link between spiritual corruption and the worship of false gods. When biblical authors warned Israel not to sacrifice to Shedim, they implied that behind the idols lay real spiritual entities. These spirits were not divine, but they were dangerous, deceptive forces that sought influence through religious systems. This connection between idolatry and spiritual hostility echoes through later Jewish and Christian writings, which consistently portray demons as craving attention, devotion, or control. What emerges from this mosaic of evidence is a picture of a world saturated with spiritual awareness. The ancient Israelites recognized that malevolent forces existed, even without explicit origin stories in canonical scripture. They lived alongside cultures that offered elaborate explanations for such beings, but Israel's identity required a reinterpretation. Rather than adopting pagan mythology, Jewish thinkers turned to the Genesis account, the story of divine beings who crossed forbidden boundaries and produced offspring that never belonged to heaven or earth. In the centuries leading up to the time of Jesus, this interpretation gained remarkable coherence. The Watcher narrative provided a unified explanation for spiritual corruption in the world, the presence of hostile spirits, and the moral chaos of the pre-flood era. It bridged the silence of the Hebrew Bible with the lived experiences of ancient communities, creating a framework that connected scripture, tradition, and everyday fears. By the time the New Testament was written, this worldview had become deeply ingrained. The phrase unclean spirits reflects a shared cultural understanding that these entities existed separately from angels, but were spiritual beings nonetheless, beings with history, purpose, and hostility rooted in an ancient transgression. As the investigation continues, the next step is to examine the figures central to this worldview: the Watchers themselves, their descent, their rebellion, and the catastrophic era that shaped the world before the flood. It is there, in the shadow of the most enigmatic event of early biblical history, that the true nature of demonic spirits begins to take form. Long before the theological systems of later Judaism and Christianity were fully developed, an older, stranger world shaped the imagination of the ancient people, a world preserved most vividly in the literature surrounding the Watchers. These heavenly beings, described in the earliest layers of Jewish tradition, occupy a unique place in the history of biblical interpretation. They bridge the gap between the cryptic lines of Genesis and the elaborate demonology that shaped the New Testament era. To understand the true origin of demonic spirits, one must first understand who the Watchers were believed to be, why they descended, and how their actions produced consequences that still echo through the pages of Scripture. The story begins with a brief but profound statement in Genesis. The sons of God saw that the daughters of humanity were beautiful, and they took them as wives. This phrase, sons of God, appears elsewhere in Scripture to describe heavenly beings assembled before the divine throne. In its original context, it carried no ambiguity. Ancient readers understood it as a reference to celestial beings who held positions of authority and responsibility in the divine order. Yet Genesis provides no details about their motives or the magnitude of their rebellion. The passage is deliberately compressed, hinting at events too complex to recount in a few verses. Enter the book of immersed Enoch, a text deeply influential in the centuries surrounding the time of Jesus. While not considered scripture within most Christian traditions today, it was widely read in ancient Judaism, quoted by early Christians, and even referenced directly in the New Testament. This work dramatically expands the story of Genesis, revealing the Watchers as a group of heavenly beings charged with observing humanity. Their role was to serve as guardians and witnesses, not participants in human affairs. But according to the Enochic narrative, they abandoned their appointed station and crossed a boundary ordained by God. The leader of this descent, named Shemi-Hazah, persuaded 200 angels to join him, forming a pact upon a mountain overlooking the valley below. The text describes their oath as a solemn agreement, a decision made with full knowledge of the consequences. Their choice was neither a moment of weakness nor an accident. It was a coordinated act of rebellion. The Watchers descended to earth, took human wives, and fathered children, unlike any beings who had existed before. These offspring, known as the Nephilim, embodied the union of the spiritual and the mortal, inheriting both the strength of their celestial fathers and the physical vulnerability of their human mothers. The arrival of the Nephilim marked a turning point in the ancient world. Their presence, described in Enochic literature, brought devastation to the earth. They consumed resources at a rate humans could not sustain, leading to conflict, scarcity, and violence. As they grew in power, they began to dominate and oppress the world around them. Their actions reflected the disorder inherent in their creation, beings born from an unnatural union, existing outside the boundaries of God's design. They became symbols of corruption, embodiments of a cosmic breakdown that affected every level of creation. Beyond their physical presence, the Watchers introduced forbidden knowledge that reshaped human civilization. Enochic tradition states that they taught metalworking, weapon-making, sorcery, astrology, and practices intended to manipulate spiritual forces. This knowledge, while seemingly beneficial at first, accelerated humanity's descent into violence and idolatry. Technological advancements became tools of oppression, and spiritual practices devolved into systems of exploitation. The world, once described in Genesis as very good, became a landscape dominated by brutality and spiritual deception. The consequences of the Watchers' actions were swift and severe. According to the Enochic narrative, the cries of humanity rose to heaven. God responded by sending archangels to intervene. Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and others were tasked with restoring order and executing judgment upon the rebellious angels and their offspring. The Watchers were bound and imprisoned in gloomy regions awaiting a final judgment. Their offspring, meanwhile, faced a different fate, one that lies at the center of our investigation. The Nephilim, though mighty, were mortal. When they died, their bodies perished, but their spirits did not. This is the critical turning point in the Enochic understanding of demons. The disembodied spirits of these hybrid beings, neither fully angelic nor fully human, were condemned to wander the earth. They had no place in heaven, for they were not heavenly. They had no place in Sheol, for they were not human. Thus they became earthbound spirits, restless and hostile, seeking to influence or inhabit the living. This explanation filled a gap in biblical thought without contradicting the canonical text. It clarified why demons in the New Testament behave the way they do. They are not fallen angels. Angels are described as powerful, consistent, and disciplined in their rebellions. Demons, however, display characteristics of beings tied to the human realm. They fear embodiment and disembodiment, seek hosts, and struggle for influence in ways that align with the nature of spirits born from flesh. Their origins in the Enochic tradition account for their constant hunger, their desire for manifestation, and their inability to find rest. Further evidence of this worldview appears in the Book of Jubilees, another influential text from the Second Temple period. Jubilees claims that a portion of these spirits remained on earth even after the flood. They were allowed to test humanity, though their power was greatly reduced. This theological framework does not depict a cosmic war between equals, but a world in which disembodied hybrid spirits exert limited but real influence. This concept shaped the expectations of Jewish communities during the intertestamental period and provides the background for many New Testament encounters with unclean spirits. As a historical document, First Enoch also highlights the ancient struggle to understand how spiritual corruption entered the world. Instead of attributing evil to abstract forces, it presents a narrative rooted in responsibility and consequence. The Watchers' descent and the birth of the Nephilim represent an early attempt to grapple with the problem of evil, how beings created good could choose rebellion, and how their actions unleashed ripple effects across creation. Archaeology adds a further dimension to this picture. Across ancient Israel and neighboring regions, excavations have uncovered architectural remains, inscriptions, and cultic objects that align with the timeline suggested by Enochic literature. The existence of fortified settlements, weapons, and ritual items from the pre-flood era remains speculative, but the cultural memory of ancient giants appears in multiple traditions. The presence of tall, fortified cities described in later biblical texts, such as those inhabited by the Anakim, may reflect echoes of these earlier narratives. While archaeology cannot confirm the existence of the Nephilim, it does reveal a memory of unusual populations or figures preserved through generations. Linguistic studies also contribute insight. The term Nephilim likely derives from a root meaning to fall or to cause to fall, suggesting beings associated with violence or the downfall of others. The word carries a weight that transcends physical height. It implies moral collapse, domination, and the shattering of boundaries between the divine and the human. These connotations reinforce the Enochic picture of the Nephilim as catalysts for the world's corruption. The Watcher narrative offers a comprehensive explanation for the strange spiritual landscape of the ancient world. It addresses why unclean spirits exist, why they behave as they do, and why Scripture describes them with a vocabulary tied to wilderness, violence, and unfulfilled longing. It also aligns with early Christian thought, which consistently distinguishes between fallen angels and demons. This distinction appears even in the New Testament. Angels are sentient divine messengers with clear roles, while unclean spirits operate chaotically, seeking hosts and exerting influence in ways that reflect their hybrid origins. By the time Jesus began his ministry, the Watcher story was widely known among Jewish communities. Its themes appear indirectly in the Gospels, where unclean spirits recognize Jesus' authority immediately. Their fear implies an awareness of their eventual fate, a judgment rooted in a rebellion older than the nations themselves. The Gospels assume that their audience understands what these beings are, even though the canonical text never explains their origin. This assumption speaks volumes about the worldview of the time. As we move forward, the next part will follow the Nephilim beyond their physical destruction, exploring how their disembodied spirits became the malevolent forces described throughout Jewish and Christian history, beings condemned to wander, influence, and inhabit, forming the foundation of what later generations would call demons. In the aftermath of the flood, when the waters receded and the world emerged into a renewed but uncertain silence, one of the greatest theological questions of the ancient era surfaced. What became of the spirits of the giants? Their bodies perished beneath the rising waters, but their spirits, according to the literature of the Second Temple period, did not. It is here in the transition between the antediluvian and post-diluvian worlds that the origin of demonic spirits comes into sharper focus. The narrative fragments preserved across ancient texts reveal a worldview in which these disembodied beings became a permanent part of human history, shaping fears, rituals, and the spiritual imagination for millennia. The Book of Jubilees, one of the most influential texts in early Judaism, describes a conversation that echoes through later interpretation. After the flood, the spirits of the Nephilim continued to roam the earth, causing trouble among Noah's descendants. According to the narrative, Noah pleaded with God for relief from these malevolent forces. The world had been cleansed of physical corruption, yet spiritual disorder persisted. In response, a command was issued. The majority of these spirits would be bound, restricted, and prevented from exerting influence on humanity. Yet a small portion, 1/10, was permitted to remain, allowed to test humanity under controlled conditions. This detail reveals an important theme in Jewish theology. Evil was not created by God, but it had been woven into the world through disobedience. The lingering spirits of the giants represented a consequence rather than a design. Their presence was tolerated but restrained, forming part of a larger divine plan to refine and challenge humanity. While the canonical scriptures do not recount this scene directly, echoes of the idea appear in the New Testament, where unclean spirits operate with limitations and are subject to divine authority. The notion that demons were the disembodied spirits of the giants helps explain their peculiar behavior. Unlike angels, who possess consistent power and deliberate intention, demons display an instability reflective of their hybrid origins. They are portrayed as wandering, restless, and bound to earthly regions. Their desire for embodiment reveals a tragic irony. Though born from flesh, they no longer possess it. Their hostility toward humans stems from an identity defined by loss and frustration. Every attempt to inhabit or influence the living can be seen as an effort to reclaim what was forfeited at the flood. One of the most distinctive traits of these spirits, according to Enochic tradition, is their association with desolate places. The New Testament records Jesus describing unclean spirits as traveling through arid places, seeking rest. This imagery aligns seamlessly with the earlier Jewish understanding that these beings avoided regions inhabited by the righteous and gravitated toward wilderness, ruins, or abandoned settlements. In the ancient imagination, such landscapes were not merely empty. They were spiritually charged, haunted by the remnants of a world destroyed. This worldview extended into daily life. Archaeological excavations in the Levant and surrounding territories reveal consistent patterns. Amulets buried beneath thresholds, inscribed bowls placed in homes, and protective formulas etched into pottery. These artifacts vary widely in their cultural origins, yet share a common purpose: shielding individuals from malevolent spirits believed to inhabit the margins of human habitation. Some inscriptions invoke divine protection, others attempt to repel hostile forces by name. Their widespread presence shows that fear of invisible beings was not limited to fringe groups. It permeated households, markets, and entire communities. Ancient texts outside of Israel also reflect this anxiety. Akkadian incantations mention spirits associated with the destruction of ancient cities. Ugaritic tablets describe beings that wander among the dead. Egyptian funerary texts warn of malevolent forces capable of afflicting the living. While none of these traditions are identical to the Enochic narrative, they reveal a shared assumption. The world was inhabited by entities that existed between the living and the dead, capable of influencing human affairs in ways that defied natural explanation. Against this backdrop, the Watcher tradition offered a uniquely coherent model. Instead of attributing strange phenomena to random ghosts or capricious deities, it provided a historical and theological origin story for the malevolent forces that people feared. The spirits of the giants were not shapeless energies. They were the lingering echoes of a rebellion that distorted creation. This explanation resonated with communities seeking to understand the cause of moral corruption, psychological affliction, and spiritual conflict. The Hebrew Bible, though silent on the detailed Enochic narrative, frequently alludes to beings whose characteristics align with this interpretation. The Seirim, goat-like spirits linked to desolate places, appear in warnings against idolatrous worship. The Sheddim are portrayed as recipients of misguided sacrifices. These terms suggest that Israel's scriptures acknowledge the presence of malevolent spirits without elaborating on their origins, leaving room for later Jewish writers to fill in the gaps through the Watcher tradition. As the theological landscape evolved, these ideas merged with the broader cultural shift that followed the Babylonian exile. Persians introduced frameworks that emphasized spiritual hierarchies and cosmic battles between righteous and wicked beings. Jewish thinkers adapted these themes into their own tradition, resulting in a more structured understanding of the spiritual realm. Angels became messengers and guardians. Demons became tempters and oppressors, and the storyline of the Watchers provided the historical basis for this cosmic division. One of the strongest evidences of this continuity appears in the writings found at Qumran. The Dead Sea Scrolls contain multiple references to spirits of wickedness, beings that afflict, deceive, or tempt the righteous. Some texts describe their chaotic movements, their association with physical illness, or their role in corrupting thought. These descriptions align closely with the traits attributed to the spirits of the giants in Enochic and Jubilees literature. The Qumran community clearly believed in a world filled with invisible forces, and they interpreted their struggles through the lens of the Watcher narrative. The concept that demons were the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim also explains their relationship to idolatry. Early Jewish and Christian writings portray demons as entities that seek attention, worship, and influence. This behavior reflects beings born from chaos, seeking validation in the structures of human religious life. When the Hebrew Bible condemns sacrifices to Sheddim, it implies that behind certain idols stood real spiritual presences, not merely stone or wood, but malevolent entities hungry for devotion. The post-flood world, according to this understanding, became a theater for spiritual conflict. The presence of these spirits shaped how people interpreted misfortune, illness, or unexplained behavior. Their influence was seen not as an all-powerful force, but as a constant pressure woven into everyday life. They were reminders of a broken boundary in the earliest days of human history and the enduring consequences of the Watchers' rebellion. The next stage of this investigation leads us deeper into the Hebrew Bible itself, into the linguistic, cultural, and theological fragments that hint at the presence of these spirits long before the detailed narratives of Enoch and Jubilees were written. Through these fragments, we begin to see how the ancient Israelites perceived spiritual danger and how their scriptures quietly preserved the memory of the world transformed by the Watchers. The Hebrew Bible does not provide a fully developed demonology, nor does it narrate the origin of malevolent spirits in explicit detail. Yet scattered across its books are linguistic fragments, ritual warnings, poetic images, and theological patterns that allow scholars to reconstruct how ancient Israel understood hostile spiritual forces. These clues, though subtle, are consistent with the views that later Jewish communities articulated more clearly, that certain beings, invisible, restless, and dangerous, operated in the margins of human life, and that their presence was tied to events far older than Israel itself. To interpret these fragments properly, it is essential to consider the world in which they were written. Israel's scriptures emerged in a cultural environment already familiar with the idea of destructive spirits. What makes the Hebrew Bible unique is not the belief in such forces, but the way it reframes them within the framework of divine sovereignty. Instead of depicting malevolent spirits as chaotic gods or independent rulers of the underworld, the biblical writers describe them as limited beings, whose power is neither absolute nor outside the boundaries set by God. This theological containment allowed the authors to acknowledge the existence of destructive forces without granting them divine status. One of the earliest and most intriguing biblical terms associated with harmful beings is serum. The word is often translated as goat demons, though the phrase captures only a fraction of its ancient significance. In several passages, the term refers to beings connected with wilderness locations, creatures haunting ruins or uninhabited places. Isaiah describes Edom's ruined cities as locations where serum shall dance, painting a picture of desolation inhabited by eerie, goat-like spirits. This imagery is not metaphorical. It reflects an ancient belief that abandoned places became domains of spiritual danger. The association of serum with desolation has strong parallels in the Enochic understanding of unclean spirits wandering arid regions. Both portray hostile entities operating at the edges of civilization, away from human settlement. These parallels are not coincidental. They reflect a shared cultural vocabulary that extended across centuries, aligning biblical imagery with the themes that later Second Temple literature made explicit. A second term of importance is shedim. This word is often translated simply as demons, but its meaning is more nuanced. In Deuteronomy, the Israelites are warned not to sacrifice to shedim, implying that these beings received offerings in certain pagan contexts. The text does not describe them as fictional or symbolic. It portrays them as actual spiritual entities that drew worship through idolatrous rituals. This depiction aligns with later Jewish and Christian interpretations that demons sought influence through the religious practices of nations surrounding Israel. The use of shedim fits naturally with the theme of malevolent spirits craving attention, devotion, or dominion, traits attributed to the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim in Enochic literature. While the Hebrew Bible does not directly connect the shedim to the Watcher's offspring, the compatibility of the concepts reveals a shared theological backdrop. Later Jewish writings simply made explicit what the biblical text leaves implied. Another important category appears in narratives involving distressing or deceiving spirits. In several passages, a spirit of disturbance, or a lying spirit, is described as afflicting individuals or influencing events. These passages do not name these spirits as demons, but portray them as entities capable of affecting human behavior, especially in moments of crisis. Such texts demonstrate that ancient Israel did not view the spiritual realm as distant or passive. The invisible world was active, capable of interacting with the human domain in ways both direct and subtle. Some scholars argue that these spirits represent metaphors or literary devices. However, the consistency with which such beings appear in historical narratives, prophetic visions, and poetic texts suggests that the biblical authors assumed the existence of unseen agents that could operate within divine sovereignty. These beings are described as purposeful, intelligent, and capable of influencing human affairs. The Hebrew Bible never portrays them as autonomous rivals to God, but it acknowledges their presence as part of the spiritual landscape. The connection between harmful spirits and idolatry is especially significant. Throughout the Hebrew Bible, idolatry is not merely a theological error. It is a gateway to spiritual corruption. Several passages imply that idols serve as conduits for malevolent forces. Psalm 82, with its portrayal of corrupt divine beings governing nations unjustly, provides a conceptual backdrop for understanding how spiritual entities might influence societies. Although the psalm does not describe demons directly, it illustrates a worldview in which spiritual beings could mislead or distort the moral direction of entire nations. This theme becomes clearer in later Jewish writings, where demons are described as manipulating idolatrous practices. The Hebrew Bible's warnings against sacrificing to Shedim thus gained deeper significance. These rituals were not merely misguided. They placed individuals in contact with harmful entities that sought power through human devotion. The biblical authors did not need to explain these beings' origins to make their warnings effective. The shared cultural understanding of the time provided the necessary context. Another revealing fragment appears in the story of the Azazel goat on the Day of Atonement. While scholars debate the meaning of the name Azazel, several early Jewish and Christian authors interpreted it as a reference to a wilderness spirit or a fallen being associated with desolation. In this ritual, one goat was sacrificed to the Lord, while the other was sent into the wilderness for Azazel. The symbolic removal of sin from the camp into a desolate environment reflects the ancient belief that wilderness regions belong to destructive entities. While the canonical text does not label Azazel a demon, later literature, especially Warrant Enoch, identifies Azazel as one of the leaders of the Watchers. This connection between wilderness, spiritual defilement, and the realm of malevolent beings is consistent across all periods of Jewish thought. The Hebrew Bible's ritual geography reflects a view in which the inhabited areas were zones of order, while the wilderness represented zones of chaos, inhabited not by animals alone, but by entities hostile to human life. The prophetic books reinforce this theme. Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel describe ruins, abandoned cities, and devastated landscapes as places where night creatures and uncanny beings take refuge. Some of these descriptions involve symbolic animals, others involve hybrid figures that resemble spiritual entities. Whether interpreted literally or metaphorically, the imagery suggests that desolation and spiritual danger were linked in the ancient imagination. These descriptions align closely with the Enochic concept of unclean spirits, wandering regions, where human life has receded. The Hebrew Bible's portrayal of harmful forces also contains a linguistic dimension. Many terms used to describe destructive or chaotic beings carry connotations of disorder, ruin, or dissolution. This linguistic pattern reflects an underlying theological message. Malevolent forces thrive where order breaks down. In this sense, spiritual danger is depicted not merely as a metaphysical threat, but as a symptom of creation's disruption, a theme consistent with the belief that the Watchers' rebellion fractured the boundaries of the natural world. Although the canonical text never narrates the full story of the Watchers, its scattered references to harmful spirits, wilderness beings, and idolatrous entities fit comfortably within the broader framework preserved in Second Temple literature. The silence of the Hebrew Bible on matters of origin allowed Jewish authors to expand on these ideas using the tools of tradition, cultural memory, and theological reflection. By examining these biblical fragments, we see a consistent pattern. The spiritual world contained beings capable of influencing human behavior, operating in desolate regions, and drawing power through idolatry. These traits mirror the characteristics later attributed to the disembodied spirits of the giants, beings bound to earth, restless, and hostile toward the living. In the next part, the narrative will shift into the post-exilic period, when Jewish demonology developed rapidly. It is here, in the centuries between the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, that the ideas scattered across Scripture began to crystallize into a coherent system, shaped by contact with other cultures, and deepened by evolving interpretations of Israel's sacred history. When the people of Judah returned from Babylonian exile, they stepped back into their homeland, with a theology forever changed by what they had witnessed abroad. The exile had shattered centuries of assumptions. Israel had lived among cultures whose spiritual systems were richly developed, highly structured, and deeply dualistic. The Babylonians, and later the Persians, possessed detailed classifications of spirits: benevolent protectors, malevolent forces, beings of light, beings of darkness. These ideas did not overwrite Israel's faith, but they reshaped the way Jewish communities articulated concepts that had always been present in their scriptures. It was during this era that Jewish demonology entered a period of rapid development, building a more organized understanding of harmful spiritual beings based on the fragments preserved in Israel's sacred texts. The Persian Empire in particular left a profound mark on Jewish thought. Persian religion, especially the system associated with Zoroastrianism, taught a worldview dominated by the cosmic struggle between good and evil spirits. While Judaism never adopted a strict dualism, God remained sovereign over all. Jewish writers began expressing the spiritual world with sharper distinctions. Angels took on more defined roles. Opposing spirits were assigned ranks, functions, and hierarchies. The world became a stage where invisible beings acted, not randomly, but according to a larger cosmic story. This cultural exchange does not mean that Jewish demonology was borrowed wholesale from Persian religion. Instead, Persian concepts provided vocabulary and structure that helped organize ideas already present in Jewish tradition, especially those connected to the Watchers. The Enochic narratives, which flourished during this era, used the language of cosmic conflict to describe the aftermath of the heavenly rebellion. They depicted angels as guardians, messengers, and cosmic administrators. They portrayed the disembodied spirits of the giants as active, hostile forces that resisted righteousness and inhabited the spaces broken by sin. These concepts resonated with a population struggling to understand the forces behind exile, suffering, and moral corruption. It is in this post-exilic atmosphere that the Book of Enoch emerged as a dominant interpretive text. Its description of the Watchers and their offspring gave Jewish communities a coherent framework for understanding the origin of evil spirits. It attributed corruption not to an eternal cosmic enemy, but to a historical event, a rebellion by heavenly beings that disrupted the order of creation. This narrative allowed Jews to maintain monotheism, while still accounting for the presence of malevolent forces that seemed to operate independently of human decisions. The Book of Jubilees also gained prominence during this period, reinforcing and expanding the Enochic worldview. Jubilees depicted the lingering spirits of the giants as part of the world's fabric, allowed to remain as tempters and testers of humanity. This idea resonated deeply with Jewish communities grappling with moral failure and its consequences. It provided a theological explanation for why temptation persisted, why societies fell into corruption, and why spiritual oppression seemed real and personal. Unlike mythological systems that attributed evil to capricious gods, the Enochic Jubilees tradition grounded spiritual danger in a historical rebellion, making it part of Israel's own sacred history. As Jewish literature expanded during the Second Temple period, demonology became increasingly detailed. The Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, contain references to spirits of wickedness, spirits of deceit, spirits of ruin, and spirits of the bastards. The last phrase widely interpreted as a reference to the hybrid offspring of the Watchers. These texts reveal an intricate understanding of the spiritual world. Spirits were not vague or symbolic. They were cataloged, classified, and described as active forces shaping thought, behavior, illness, and social decay. The Qumran community viewed itself as engaged in a constant struggle against harmful spirits, describing their presence in terms of both internal temptation and external oppression. Their writings portrayed demons as entities with specific agendas, capable of influencing individuals and nations alike. This aligns closely with the Enochic worldview, where the spirits of the giants wander the earth seeking influence, thriving in moral chaos, and attempting to undermine righteousness. This period also witnessed the rise of apocalyptic literature, a genre that brought together heavenly visions, cosmic battles, and revelations about spiritual beings. Texts such as Daniel, while canonical, reflect the same heightened awareness of spiritual conflict that characterized the broader Jewish world. The princes of Persia and Greece, described in Daniel's visions, illustrate a belief in spiritual hierarchies influencing geopolitical realities. Though not labeled as demons in the modern sense, these beings illustrate the idea that unseen forces governed events on earth, aligning neatly with the broader Second Temple understanding of the spiritual realm. It is here that Jewish demonology becomes truly distinct. Unlike polytheistic systems, where malevolent spirits often possessed autonomous power, Second Temple Judaism placed all spiritual beings, good or evil, under the sovereignty of the God of Israel. Even the disembodied spirits of the giants, though hostile and dangerous, operated within boundaries permitted by God. This preserved monotheism while allowing for a complex spiritual ecosystem. Evil existed, but it did not rival God. It troubled creation, but it did not triumph over it. The influence of Greek culture during the Hellenistic period added further layers to Jewish demonology. Greek thought introduced categories such as daimones, intermediate beings between gods and humans. While Jewish writers did not adopt Greek metaphysical systems, the terminology provided a linguistic tool for describing spirits that were neither angels nor purely human. In some Jewish texts of the era, the Greek word daimonion appears, later becoming the standard term for demon in the New Testament. This linguistic shift did not change Jewish belief, but it gave Jews living in Greek-speaking regions a way to communicate their spiritual worldview within the dominant language of the Mediterranean world. By the time the New Testament era arrived, Jewish demonology had developed into a highly structured system. Demons were understood as the disembodied spirits of the giants, hostile toward humanity, wandering in desolate regions, seeking embodiment, influencing idolatry, afflicting through illness and deception, organized into ranks and functions, and operating under limitations enforced by God. This framework explains why the New Testament's portrayal of unclean spirits is so consistent with the Enochic tradition. Jesus and his contemporaries spoke about demons as entities with identity, knowledge, and fear, a fear especially directed toward divine judgment. Their reactions in the Gospels make sense only in light of a worldview that saw these beings as remnants of an ancient catastrophe, awaiting a final reckoning. One of the most striking aspects of Second Temple demonology is its emphasis on the psychological and moral dimensions of spiritual influence. Spirits were not merely external objects of fear. They were perceived as influencing thought patterns, impulses, and desires. The Qumran texts describe spirits capable of bending the will, darkening counsel, and turning the heart away from wisdom. These descriptions anticipate the New Testament's language about spiritual warfare, temptation, and moral transformation. This era also solidified the belief that harmful spirits played a role in physical illness. Many Jewish writings describe diseases as caused or aggravated by unclean spirits. This belief was not universal. Many Jews differentiated between natural illness and spiritual affliction, but it was common enough to form part of the cultural backdrop of Jesus' ministry. The Gospels reflect this mixed understanding, distinguishing between ordinary sickness and demonic influence without confusing the two. By the time of Jesus, the idea that demons originated from the spirits of the giants had become the dominant view among Jewish thinkers. While variations existed, this interpretation provided a comprehensive explanation for the nature, behavior, and limitations of malevolent spirits. It also aligned with early Christian teaching, which consistently distinguished demons from fallen angels. The next part of this investigation will move into the New Testament itself, examining how the earliest Christian authors understood unclean spirits, how they inherited and transformed earlier Jewish thought, and why their descriptions align so closely with the Enochic tradition that shaped the world into which Jesus was born. By the 1st century, The theological terrain of the ancient Near East had shifted dramatically. Jewish demonology, once a scattered collection of ideas and warnings embedded in the Hebrew Bible, had solidified into a sophisticated worldview. This development formed the backdrop for the New Testament's encounters with unclean spirits, a term that appears with striking regularity across the Gospels and Acts. These spirits are portrayed as intelligent, vocal, fearful, and deeply aware of their fate. Their behavior and characteristics align so closely with the Enochic tradition that scholars widely agree. The New Testament assumes its audience already knows the origin and identity of these beings, even though the canonical text never explains them directly. The phrase unclean spirits reflects the cultural vocabulary of the time. It did not refer simply to beings that were morally impure. It pointed toward entities fundamentally out of place, spirits whose existence was a byproduct of disorder. The term communicated both their nature and their origin without having to recount the entire Watcher narrative. For first-century Jews, unclean spirits were understood to be the disembodied spirits of the giants, condemned to wander the earth after the flood. This assumption shaped how early Christians interpreted their encounters with these beings. One of the most revealing features of New Testament demonology is the behavior of the spirits themselves. They speak. They recognize Jesus. They express fear. They plead not to be tormented before the appointed time. These responses reflect a worldview in which demons know the story of their past and understand the consequences of divine judgment. Their fear is not emotional panic, but theological awareness. They are conscious of the rebellion of the Watchers, the destruction of their physical bodies, and the judgment their spirits await. Such awareness makes sense only if their identity is tied to a historical event rather than an abstract concept of evil. Another key detail in the Gospels is the demon's desire for embodiment. When Jesus casts out a legion of spirits in the region of the Gerasenes, they beg to enter a herd of pigs rather than remain disembodied. This behavior is consistent with the Enochic understanding that the spirits of the giants, born of flesh yet deprived of it after death, crave physical form. They seek embodiment not out of malice alone, but because their existence is defined by loss. Their presence in the world is a reminder of an ancient transgression, and their desire for a host reflects their displaced nature. The New Testament's descriptions of demonic influence also mirror themes that developed in the Second Temple period. Demons are shown to afflict individuals morally, physically, and psychologically, causing afflictions that range from muteness and seizures to self-destructive behavior. Yet the Gospel writers distinguish clearly between natural illness and demonic oppression, reflecting a nuanced worldview. Not every sickness is attributed to spirits, but certain conditions, particularly those involving sudden violence or self-harm, were understood as signs of spiritual intrusion. These portrayals align with earlier Jewish writings that describe the lingering spirits of the giants as entities that attack, deceive, or distort human behavior. The continuity between the Enochic tradition and the New Testament becomes even clearer when examining the way Jesus confronts these spirits. He does not treat them as fallen angels, with the authority and strength of heavenly beings. Instead, he addresses them as earthbound entities, hostile, dangerous, but limited. They obey instantly, not because he is annihilating cosmic rivals, but because they exist under divine constraint and recognize his authority. One of the most compelling examples of this worldview appears in the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus describes unclean spirits as wandering through waterless places. This imagery echoes the ancient belief that the spirits of the giants roamed desolate regions, seeking rest they could never find. The consistency between Jesus' description and the ideas preserved in Enoch and Jubilees suggests a shared cultural understanding of what these spirits were and how they operated. The apostles and early Christian missionaries also inherited this worldview. In the book of Acts, unclean spirits react to the authority of Jesus' name, acknowledging the same hierarchy evident in the Gospels. Early Christian communities interpreted demonic influence in terms that matched Jewish expectations. Demons sought control, influenced religious practices, and caused spiritual or moral harm. They were not fallen angels, but disembodied beings tied to the human realm. This interpretation becomes even more evident when examining the writings of the early Church Fathers. Authors like Justin Martyr, Athenagoras, Tertullian, and Irenaeus consistently describe demons as the spirits of the Nephilim, the offspring of the Watchers and human women. They distinguish sharply between angels who rebelled and the spirits that arose from their offspring. Fallen angels, according to these writers, retained their heavenly nature, while demons were the restless souls of beings who were never meant to exist. Justin Martyr writes that these spirits are the souls of the wicked dead, the offspring of the Watchers. Athenagoras echoes this view, arguing that demons are the spirits of the giants who roam the earth. Irenaeus, a key figure in the development of Christian theology, affirms that demons originated from the unlawful union of angels with women. These interpretations were not fringe ideas. They represented the mainstream consensus of early Christian thought. The consistency across Jewish and Christian sources highlights a striking fact. For centuries, believers understood the origin of demons not as a mysterious gap in Scripture, but as a historical event embedded in their inherited tradition. The Watcher narrative provided a coherent explanation for the behavior of malevolent spirits in the New Testament, linking them to the prehistoric world described in Genesis. This worldview made sense of the linguistic, cultural, and theological patterns that shaped first-century Judaism. The New Testament also reinforces another important distinction. Demons operate primarily in the human realm, seeking control over individuals or communities. Fallen angels, by contrast, appear in Scripture as powerful beings with specific missions, often restrained or judged by God in dramatic ways. Demons influence the mind and body. Angels influence history and nations. This distinction reflects two different categories of spiritual beings, each with a unique origin and role. The Gospels portray Jesus not simply as a healer, but as a conqueror of the spiritual forces that had plagued humanity since the days of the Watchers. His authority over unclean spirits represents a direct challenge to the legacy of the ancient rebellion. When the spirits recognize him, their fear is rooted in a memory far older than the Roman Empire, older even than the covenant at Sinai. They see in him the one who holds the power to end their wandering and enact the judgment they know awaits them. As early Christians spread their message across the Mediterranean world, they carried with them a worldview shaped by these Jewish concepts. Their encounters with demonic forces were interpreted through the lens of the ancient narrative. Demons were spirits condemned to earth, limited yet dangerous, active yet defeated in principle by the authority of Christ. In the next part, this investigation will turn to how the early church fathers articulated and refined this understanding, how they drew from both Scripture and inherited Jewish tradition to explain the identity of malevolent spirits, and how their writings solidified a theological consensus that would endure for centuries. As Christianity spread across the Roman world, the early church faced not only theological questions, but also practical encounters with what believers understood to be demonic activity. The earliest Christian writers, those we now call the Church Fathers, were tasked with interpreting these experiences in light of Scripture, inherited Jewish tradition, and the intellectual environment of the Greco-Roman world. In doing so, they built the first systematic Christian demonology. What is remarkable, from a historical standpoint, is how consistently these early thinkers affirmed the same idea, that demons were the disembodied spirits of the giants, the offspring of the Watchers described in Genesis and elaborated in 1 Enoch. Among the earliest witnesses to this belief is Athenagoras of Athens, a Christian philosopher, writing in the 2nd century. In his apologetic works addressed to the Roman emperor, Athenagoras describes demons as the spirits of the giants, who were born from the unlawful union between heavenly beings and human women. His explanation is not speculative. He presents it as the widely accepted understanding among Christians of his time. Athenagoras argues that these spirits wander the earth, causing disturbances, influencing idolatry, and seeking to attach themselves to susceptible individuals. His writings demonstrate just how deeply the Enochic tradition had shaped early Christian thought. Justin Martyr, one of the most influential thinkers of the 2nd century, affirmed the same idea. He argued that the angels who sinned produced offspring, who became instruments of spiritual corruption. When these offspring died in the flood, their spirits continued to roam the world, corrupting human hearts and driving people toward idolatry. Justin's writings often seek to explain why pagan religions had such powerful emotional and cultural influence. He contends that demons manipulated these systems from behind the scenes, using them to gain attention and worship. This view allowed early Christians to frame idolatry not merely as error, but as active spiritual deception. Irenaeus of Lyons, one of the foundational theologians of early Christianity, also affirmed the watcher origin of demons. In his monumental work Against Heresies, he describes the giants as wicked beings, whose spirits became the demons that later tormented humanity. His account closely mirrors the Jewish tradition preserved in Enoch and Jubilees. For Irenaeus, the ancient rebellion of the Watchers explained why the world was filled with spiritual conflict and why human tendencies toward violence, lust, and idolatry were so persistent. The narrative provided a historical anchor for understanding the universal presence of evil. Tertullian, a North African Christian writer, continued this line of thought. In his works, he describes demons as the offspring of angels and women, whose spirits remain active long after their bodies perished. Tertullian uses this explanation to account for the spiritual experiences of everyday Christians, especially in contexts where believers felt oppressed, tempted, or spiritually attacked. He also emphasizes that demons seek embodiment, pointing again to the Enochic tradition that the spirits of the giants crave physical form. Clement of Alexandria, Origen, and other early church fathers echoed these ideas with varying degrees of detail. While some introduced additional philosophical interpretations influenced by Greek thought, the core belief remained stable. Demons were not fallen angels, but the spirits of the hybrid beings produced by their rebellion. This distinction mattered deeply to the early church. Fallen angels were understood as powerful entities whose rebellion caused cosmic disruption. Demons, by contrast, were weaker, earthbound, and tied primarily to individual temptation and moral corruption. Their strength lay not in their inherent power, but in their proximity to human behavior and desire. This early Christian consensus raises an important historical question. Why did these thinkers embrace a tradition not explicitly spelled out in the canonical text? The answer lies in the world they inhabited. In the first centuries of Christianity, the Book of Enoch was widely read, especially among Jewish Christians. It was quoted in several early writings, referenced indirectly in others, and even cited in the New Testament, where the Epistle of Jude draws directly from Enoch's prophecy. The early church fathers inherited a worldview in which the Watcher narrative was considered authoritative background, even if not part of the formal canon in later centuries. Furthermore, the early church was immersed in a cultural environment familiar with spiritual practices, occult rituals, and belief in malevolent entities. Pagan temples across the Roman Empire offered sacrifices to deities that Christians interpreted as demons seeking worship. Mystery religions promised secret knowledge and transformative experiences that early Christians saw as spiritual distortions. In this environment, the Watcher narrative provided a powerful framework for understanding how such forces emerged and why they influenced human societies. The Enochic interpretation also offered moral and psychological insight. If demons were the spirits of beings born from violence, lust, and rebellion, then their influence on the human mind would reflect those same traits. Early Christian writers often describe demons as amplifiers of destructive impulses: anger, greed, lust, fear, and pride. They attributed these tendencies not merely to personal weakness, but to the lingering presence of spirits that thrived on human vulnerability. This perspective allowed the early church to interpret spiritual warfare not only as a cosmic struggle, but as an internal battle fought within the individual. The writings of the early church fathers also demonstrate the continuity between New Testament demonology and Second Temple Jewish thought. While the canonical scriptures do not explicitly identify demons as the spirits of the giants, The Gospels and Acts present them in ways that align with this interpretation. Their behavior, their fear of judgment, and their desperate search for embodiment all reflect traits found in Enochic literature. The early church fathers did not invent this connection, they inherited it. In the Roman world, where philosophical schools debated the nature of the soul and the existence of spiritual beings, early Christians used the Watcher narrative to articulate a coherent worldview. It explained why the world was morally fractured, why idolatry held power, and why spiritual oppression persisted. It also provided a theological context for the ministry of Jesus, who confronted unclean spirits not simply as sources of sickness or mental torment, but as remnants of an ancient rebellion waiting for judgment. Even as Christianity grew and diversified, the Watcher origin of demons remained a dominant theme for centuries. It shaped monastic teachings, influenced early interpretations of spiritual disciplines, and guided the Church's understanding of temptation and moral struggle. Only in the later Middle Ages, when access to Jewish apocryphal literature diminished and new philosophical frameworks emerged, did Christians begin to shift toward the idea that demons were fallen angels themselves. But in the world of the early Church, the world closest to the Apostles and the New Testament, the consensus was clear. Demons were the restless, wandering spirits of the Nephilim, confined to earth, hostile to humanity, and bound to a story older than civilization itself. In the next part, we will step into the world uncovered by archaeology, examining amulets, inscriptions, household objects, and ancient rituals that reveal how people across the ancient Near East sought protection against these malevolent spirits. These physical discoveries provide a rare glimpse into the daily lives of those who lived with constant awareness of the invisible, and whose fears and practices align strikingly with the traditions preserved in Jewish literature and early Christian teaching. Across the ancient Near East, long before modern categories of psychology or medicine existed, people lived with an unbroken awareness of spiritual danger. Their world was shaped by drought, famine, war, and disease, but also by invisible forces they believed filled deserts, ruins, and abandoned sanctuaries. For modern readers, these ideas can seem distant or symbolic, but archaeology has revealed that belief in harmful spirits was not abstract mythology. It was a lived reality, shaping daily routines, household architecture, burial practices, and personal protection rituals. What is striking is how consistently these discoveries align with the worldview expressed in Jewish literature of the Second Temple period, a world inhabited by earthbound spirits that sought to harm, influence, or attach themselves to the living. One of the most illuminating categories of archaeological evidence comes from protective amulets, found in homes, graves, and public buildings across the Levant. These objects were crafted to protect individuals from spiritual threats. Some carried inscriptions invoking the name of the God of Israel, while others contained hybrid imagery drawn from multiple cultures. Their function was always the same: to create a barrier between the living and the unseen, forces believed to wander the world. The practice was so widespread that it crossed cultural, linguistic, and religious boundaries. Israelites, Canaanites, Phoenicians, Aramaeans, and later Jewish communities all used amulets, though with differing theologies behind them. Among these artifacts, inscribed bowls from Mesopotamia and surrounding regions stand out. These bowls, often buried upside down beneath the threshold of a home, contained spiraling inscriptions written in Aramaic or Mandaic scripts. The text invoked divine protection, calling upon heavenly beings to repel destructive spirits that sought to enter the household. Some inscriptions even named specific classes of harmful entities, describing their movements, characteristics, or methods of attack. Though written centuries after the era of the Watchers, these bowls reflect a worldview rooted in earlier traditions. Spirits wander the earth, seek access to homes, and must be restrained by divine authority. Jewish versions of these bowls reveal the same assumptions. Their inscriptions often invoke angels or scriptural phrases, reflecting a distinctly monotheistic adaptation of a broader Near Eastern ritual. While the text does not name the spirits as the offspring of the giants, The descriptions match the characteristics preserved in Enochic literature: beings that move invisibly, cause harm, influence sleep, disturb thought, and attach themselves to vulnerable individuals. The continuity between archaeological evidence and ancient Jewish writings is unmistakable. Another category of artifacts comes from household figurines, discovered in Israelite and neighboring settlements. These small clay figures often represent hybrid creatures or symbolic guardians. While some served as idols, others appear to function as spiritual protectors, placed in homes to repel malevolent forces. The concept of using physical objects to ward off invisible entities reflects a belief that spirits could be deterred, repelled, or confused through ritual action. This belief aligns with the Enochic description of the lingering spirits of the giants, which thrive in chaos and vulnerability, but recoil at divine authority. Even more revealing are the inscriptions found on personal items, jewelry, seals, and metal plaques, worn for protection against unseen forces. These inscriptions often contain short phrases invoking divine names or heavenly beings. Some include warnings addressed directly to spirits, commanding them to depart or prohibiting them from afflicting the wearer. Such inscriptions imply a cultural assumption that spirits operated at close range, interacting with individuals in ways that required constant vigilance. Archaeologists have also uncovered ritual texts describing the dangers posed by wandering spirits. Some of these texts come from Ugarit, where scribes recorded incantations designed to protect the living from beings associated with death or desolation. Others come from Mesopotamia, where exorcistic prayers sought to identify, address, and expel harmful spirits. These texts often describe spirits as hungry, restless, or deprived of rest, traits that align closely with the idea that demons are disembodied beings without a natural home. The presence of such artifacts across the Near East raises an important question. Were these practices simply pagan superstition, or did they reflect a deeper cultural memory of events preserved in the Watcher narrative? While archaeology cannot confirm the historical truth of the Enochic story, it demonstrates that ancient people believed in the existence of beings whose behavior matches the description of the spirits of the giants. These spirits were thought to cause sudden illness, mental distress, violent impulses, nightmares, and social disruption. They were attracted to vulnerability, but repelled by divine protection, a pattern consistent across cultures. One area where archaeology provides especially compelling evidence is burial practice. Some ancient graves were deliberately constructed with features meant to prevent the dead from wandering: stones placed over bodies, weighted coverings, or sealed compartments. These practices reflect a fear that certain individuals might not remain at rest after death. While not every culture made such distinctions, enough examples exist to suggest that people feared the possibility of spirits becoming detached from the underworld. Jewish literature took this fear further, proposing that some spirits were not merely restless, but were never meant to exist in the first place. Archaeological evidence from the region of Bashan, associated in the Hebrew Bible with the Rephaim and other ancient giant-like beings, reveals massive megalithic structures whose purpose remains unknown. While these structures do not prove the existence of giants, they testify to a cultural memory of unusually powerful or imposing figures associated with specific regions. Biblical texts connect these regions with descendants of ancient giants, suggesting that memory of pre-flood beings persisted for generations. Another window into ancient belief comes from the practice of boundary rituals. Many Near Eastern cultures viewed city limits as zones requiring special protection. Rituals were performed to guard against harmful spirits believed to gather at margins and liminal spaces. These rituals often involved sacrifices, inscriptions, or symbolic actions marking the perimeter of a settlement. In Jewish tradition, the idea of setting boundaries appears in practices such as mezuzot and certain protective prayers, though with a monotheistic reinterpretation. The underlying concept, that malevolent forces congregate at thresholds, echoes the Enochic understanding of demons as beings tied to desolation and boundary spaces. The cumulative archaeological evidence reveals a consistent picture. Ancient people believed themselves surrounded by invisible forces that operated outside the natural order. These beings were not treated as gods, nor as ghosts in the modern sense, but as hostile entities tied to brokenness, death, and moral corruption. Their behavior, as described in ritual texts and protective incantations, corresponds with the traits of the disembodied spirits of the giants. This alignment suggests that the Enochic tradition, rather than being a later invention, reflected a worldview widely shared across the ancient Near East. In Jewish communities specifically, archaeological discoveries show that fears about spirits were not limited to folk practices. Even groups devoted to monotheism used objects, inscriptions, and rituals to safeguard against spiritual harm. This pattern aligns with the Dead Sea Scrolls, which present a world filled with spiritual forces actively shaping human experience. The archaeological and textual evidence together reveal a world where the boundaries between the seen and unseen were deeply porous. As Christianity emerged, early believers inherited this world and its assumptions. They did not invent the concept of malevolent spirits. They interpreted it through the lens of Scripture, Jewish tradition, and the teachings of Jesus. Archaeology reveals the lived reality behind these beliefs, a reality where ancient people felt surrounded by spirits, searching for influence or embodiment. In the final part of this investigation, we will examine how modern scholarship approaches the question of the origin of demonic spirits. While not all scholars agree on the details, many recognize that the Enochic tradition offers the most coherent explanation for the evidence preserved in Scripture, ancient literature, archaeology, and early Christian teaching. The conclusion will bring together all these threads, showing how the Watcher narrative remains the most historically grounded and theologically consistent account of the true origin of demonic spirits. Modern scholarship approaches the question of demonic origins with caution, rigor, and a deep respect for the ancient world's complexity. Scholars of the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, ancient Judaism, and Near Eastern archaeology understand that the beliefs of ancient people cannot be reduced to modern categories. Their worldview was not shaped by materialism or clinical psychology, but by the conviction that visible and invisible realities were intertwined. To recover their perspective, researchers sift through texts, artifacts, languages, and cultural practices, searching for coherence across thousands of years. What emerges from this vast interdisciplinary effort is a picture far more unified than many expect. The Enochic tradition offers the most historically grounded, culturally consistent, and theologically coherent explanation for the origin of demonic spirits. One of the strongest evidences in favor of the Watcher origin lies in the sheer breadth of ancient sources that align with it. The Hebrew Bible's fragments of wilderness spirits, idolatrous entities, and deceptive forces all hint at beings that defy simple categorization. The texts do not call these beings fallen angels, nor do they portray them as human ghosts. Instead, they describe entities that move through desolation, attach themselves to human behavior, and influence moral corruption. These characteristics match precisely the traits attributed to the disembodied spirits of the giants in the Jewish literature of the Second Temple period. When scholars examine the Book of Enoch, they find a worldview that explains these biblical fragments without contradicting the canonical text. Enoch's narrative does not introduce a foreign mythology. It provides detail to a cryptic biblical passage about the sons of God and the Nephilim. It presents a historical catastrophe rooted in disobedience, a rebellion by heavenly beings that produced offspring born outside the divine order. When those beings died, their spirits remained bound to earth, restless and hostile. This account not only explains the Hebrew Bible's ambiguous spiritual beings, but also offers a foundation for the New Testament's portrayal of demons. The New Testament's depiction of unclean spirits is particularly compelling in this regard. The behavior of these spirits, seeking embodiment, expressing fear of judgment, and operating in desolate places, aligns seamlessly with the Enochic description of the spirits of the giants. Jesus' interactions with these beings reflect an inherited Jewish understanding that did not need explicit explanation. Scholars note that the Gospels assume their readers know what an unclean spirit is, even though the term's origin is never defined within the canonical text. This silence suggests that the explanation lay in widely accepted Jewish tradition, especially the Watcher narrative. Early Christian writers provide further confirmation. Figures such as Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Athenagoras, Tertullian, and others consistently describe demons as the spirits of the giants, offspring of the Watchers who died in the flood. Their explanations match the Enochic tradition almost exactly. These authors lived far closer to the world of Jesus and the apostles than modern interpreters do. They spoke the languages of the time, understood the cultural assumptions of early Christian communities, and possessed access to Jewish literature now lost or fragmentary. Their agreement is not evidence of speculation but of continuity. They believed what the first Christians believed, which was what many Jews believed. Demons originated from a rebellion older than the nations themselves. Archaeology reinforces this picture by revealing how deeply belief in wandering, harmful spirits permeated the ancient Near East. Protective amulets, inscribed bowls, household figurines, boundary rituals, burial practices, and ritual texts all reflect a fear of beings that were not gods, not human ghosts, and not abstractions. These beings were understood as restless, hostile, and attracted to vulnerability, precisely the attributes assigned to the disembodied spirits of the giants. While archaeology cannot confirm the historicity of the Watcher narrative, it demonstrates that the spiritual environment assumed by Warren Enoch in the New Testament was not an invention. It reflected lived experience across multiple cultures. Scholars of ancient Judaism increasingly recognize that Second Temple literature provides the missing context for understanding the spiritual world of the New Testament. The centuries between the end of the Hebrew Bible and the birth of Jesus were not theologically silent. They were an era of intense reflection, interpretation, and debate. Jewish communities wrestled with the meaning of evil, the nature of spiritual beings, and the events of the antediluvian world. Their writings reveal a sophisticated theology that integrated biblical fragments with cultural experience, producing a coherent demonology that early Christians inherited. Modern scholars do not universally agree on the historical accuracy of the Watcher narrative, but many acknowledge that it represents the most complete explanation of the origin of demons within ancient Judaism. It accounts for the behavior of unclean spirits in the Gospels. It aligns with early Christian interpretation. It integrates archaeological evidence of protective rituals, and it provides a framework that does not contradict monotheism. The Watcher tradition portrays evil not as an equal rival to God, but as the result of free beings, angelic and human, violating divine boundaries. This distinction is central to ancient Jewish and Christian theology. Demons were not fallen angels with celestial power. They were the disembodied spirits of hybrid beings, whose existence itself was a corruption of creation. Their nature, earthbound, restless, destructive, reflected their origins. They were tied to the world by birth, confined to it by judgment, and tormented by a future they could neither escape nor resist. This interpretation explains why demons seek embodiment. They are beings born from flesh, but stripped of it forever. It explains their fear of Jesus. He represents the final execution of judgment declared over them in the earliest days of human history. And it explains their focus on human influence. Their rebellion began through humanity, and their influence continues through it. In the modern era, many readers approach biblical demonology through the lens of medieval theology or popular imagination. But when we return to the world of ancient Judaism and early Christianity, a clearer picture emerges, one grounded in ancient texts, cultural context, and archaeological evidence. The Watcher narrative was not marginal or obscure. It was a central explanation for the presence of malevolent spirits in the world, embraced by communities that lived with constant awareness of the invisible. Bringing together every thread of this investigation, scripture, apocrypha, archaeology, ancient languages, early Christian writings, and modern scholarship, the conclusion is both simple and profound. In the world of the Bible, the true origin of demonic spirits lies not in fallen angels, nor in mythic abstractions, but in the lingering spirits of the giants, the offspring of the Watchers, whose rebellion scarred the earliest chapters of human history. This understanding shaped the worldview of Jesus' contemporaries, influenced the earliest Christian teachings, and remains the most historically coherent model for interpreting ancient demonology. It portrays evil not as an independent force, but as a tragic consequence of disobedience, a fracture in creation that ultimately serves as a backdrop for the greater story of restoration, redemption, and divine authority over all that exists.